Hello, this is International Master Nigel Povah, who actually had the privilege of running the Guildford Junior session yesterday for session number 8, and I took the top group whilst Andrew Martin had the rest of the attendees. And I wanted to focus on how to ensure that you get a good development and how to exploit the fact that your opponent might leave his or her king in the centre, and how to sort of launch an attack under such circumstances. So I wanted to do this by showing the group a few positions and to see what they thought of those positions, what ideas they had, and whether they could see what was going on. So the game in question that I showed them was a game that I played against International Master Andrew Ledger back in 2003, so quite some time ago, indeed well before all of the juniors present were born. This was played in a Guildford match, Surrey Trophy match against Redhill. Anyway, so the game opened with me playing pawn to d4, and Andrew replied with pawn to d5. And of course this is a fairly standard territory, and in this position 2c4 is the normal reply, which gives us the Queen's Gambit. But I've often played various things to offer my opponents a less familiar territory, and in this particular game I chose to play this particular move, bishop to g5, which is not a particularly well-known move. As the group mentioned, one of them said, "Oh, it's a Trompovsky," and I said, "Well, no, the Trompovsky is when the knight is on f6 rather than, and black's d pawn is back on d7, and then white plays 2 bishop g5. In this case, the knight may or may not come out to f6, or at least not early. So this is sometimes called the pseudo Trompovsky, because it's similar in some ways, and it can of course transpose. But in this particular instance, my Andrew played c5. Now the most common moves here are h6 and c6. c5, just like c6, aims to create a possibility of bringing the black queen to b6, targeting the b2 pawn quite early, which of course is weak because the bishop has been developed. Now I've had this pseudo Trompovsky line in over 100 games, and on a few occasions I've had people play c5 against me. Mind you, most of those 100 games were played in blitz, but I've had a lot of classical games in this line as well. Anyway, with c5, black immediately challenges the white centre, and there are various ways of responding here, but probably one of the best moves is simply to capture the pawn, because that now says to black, right, okay, you better go about recapturing that pawn, otherwise I might ultimately secure it with b4 and c3, a3, and rigidly hold on to the c5 pawn. Okay, that might give black an opportunity to develop, but anyway, black may not want to make life difficult for himself, so perhaps it was no surprise that Andrew played queen a5 check, which is a pretty standard reply here, aiming to regain the pawn quite quickly, and I replied in a fairly standard fashion with knight c3. And immediately black now has a problem, because he can't play queen takes c5 here, because white would simply play queen takes d5 and be a safe pawn ahead and have slight lead in development. So in this position, actually, white's scored quite well, because he already has a slight lead in development with his 2 pieces developed, and thus far just the black queen developed. Anyway, it's no surprise that black's next move here, which Andrew played, is e6, guarding that d5 pawn. And now I played a move that I knew was the best move here, and one I've played on quite a few occasions. I played pawn to e4. White's trying to blow the position open to exploit the fact that he's got a lead in development. And in this position, Andrew chose to play bishop takes c5, and we'll look at that move in just a moment. But I asked the group what would happen if instead black played d takes e4. And it was interesting, the group came up with various ideas. I remember moves like bishop d2 being mentioned. I think bishop b5 check got mentioned as well, which would be a reasonable move. But in fact, as I said to them, there's a really good move here. Somebody wanted to play queen to d8 check, and I said, well, that would be a great move, checkmate in fact, but for the fact that the black queen on a5 would obviously capture that queen. So I said, bearing that in mind, what might white play here, because he wants to have that threat of queen d8 check with mate. And it didn't take them long, therefore, to come up with the best move here, which is b4. And the whole point is this b pawn, which attacks the queen, of course, is immune. Black cannot capture it because queen d8 would be mate. So it didn't take the group very long to spot that the only move here is queen to c7, and then it didn't take them long either to see that knight b5 attacking the queen was quite an appealing move, after which black has only one move, and that is queen to d7. And I didn't continue asking them what they thought here, because I thought this would take a while to go through the line, but I pointed out that a good move here, which isn't always the move you'd want to play in such a position, but a good move here is to trade queens. Now, you wouldn't normally want to trade queens because you've got an attack, but in this particular case, black is rather, unfortunately, although the queen can be recaptured in 3 different ways, only one of them is safe, and that one way is king takes d7, because if he were to capture, shall we say, with the knight, then white delivers an immediate checkmate with knight c7, and the same would be true if black were to recapture on d7 with the bishop. So instead he recaptures with the king, a false move. And now I said, what do you play? And rook d1 check was suggested, to which I said, well, why not castle at the same time? And after king c6, which is forced, you can't play king e8 because rook d8 would be mate again. I asked them what they thought, and there were several suggestions, and one of those suggestions was knight d4 check, and I said, yes, that is a good move, but in fact the move that I've tended to play in this position, which has done very well, is rook to d8. And the advantage of that move is you're attacking the 2 bishops. Black's reply is forced, knight to d7, which guards both bishops, and now white can just play a very powerful continuation, check, followed by the black capturing, and now you take on here, and then after king to d5, white can simply play in this position king to b2, guarding the a pawn. And I said, we don't really need to analyse this position any further, because from a material point of view, white actually is a pawn ahead, so he's not had to give up material to achieve this very dominant position. The black king side is yet to develop, and indeed will have a problem developing because of the pin on the back rank. Meanwhile, the black king on d5 is the best developed piece and will no doubt come under further attacks, and one would imagine it wouldn't be long before the king gets mated. So this is a pretty ghastly position, and clearly one that should be avoided. So if we go back to the position after e4, instead of taking the pawn on e4, which was the line we just looked at, as I mentioned, the move played by Andrew was to take on c5, and I now grabbed the pawn on offer on d5, and whereupon Andrew played what looks like an obvious and powerful move, queen to b6, and he has twin threats here of queen takes the pawn on b2 and bishop takes f2 check, which would then also threaten to take the knight on g1. But I'd seen that this was coming, of course, and I saw that I had an effective reply, which was to play queen to d2. This guards the f2 pawn, and it guards the knight, so that if he were to capture on b2, I've got rook b1 as an immediate reply, followed by knight b5 and a very powerful attack. So in this position, Andrew played the move I kind of expected him to play, but in fact it's not the best. He played this check here. What would have been best would have been to play a little more cautiously and just attack my bishop, not try and win material here and just get on with some development. But after these moves, white stands much better, because white's got good development and is a pawn ahead. So this would have been a good variation for me. But we didn't go down that route. Andrew played what he thought was a strong move, potentially a winning move, but in fact it isn't. And the reason is I'd seen how I would meet this, and it is to take here. Now Andrew played the obvious instant reply, taking here with a fork, and clearly I'm going to lose material. Both the rook and the knight are on prees, and I can't save them both. However, I'd seen this coming, of course, and I'd seen that I had a strong reply here. And I asked the group at this point, okay, what does white do? What is the best move here? And the group had various suggestions. Queen d4 was one of them, targeting the g7 pawn. I think bringing the rook back to d1 was another, but you're giving up the knight with check, and that gives black ample time to sort of consolidate, or start to try and consolidate. So I said, no, it's none of those. And after a few minutes, when they clearly weren't coming up with the move, I showed them the move that I played, which was king to d2. And this move, which isn't obvious because, you know, it's moving the king voluntarily, and it's leaving a rook on pre. So rather than save the rook and give up the knight, I've done the opposite. I've given up a rook instead of a knight. And although I'm a piece ahead at the moment, I'm in effect giving up the exchange. But the key thing is, I knew and could see that I had a very good lead in development, and I believe that, you know, the knight was probably going to be a more useful piece than the rook in some ways, and I would be able to quickly activate my pieces and gain a strong attack. And in fact, the way the game goes, and you know, when I looked after the game, looked at it with the benefit of engines, there was no question of the fact that this move is good, and the game, this position now, is in fact almost totally won for white. Black is in real difficulties. Anyway, the game continued with the obvious queen takes a1, and here I could have played bishop b5 check, which was a move that the group suggested, and is a perfectly reasonable move. But instead, I'd seen again the move I wanted to play, which is knight to f3. I simply develop a piece with the threat now of bishop b5 check, which would see me winning his queen. So I brought a third piece out, so I've got 3 pieces developed. My queen is going to join the attack quickly, and my bishop's going to come to b5 before very long, and that will allow my rook to join the game as well. So, you know, I was pretty confident here that I had a very strong position. Anyway, Andrew developed a piece, and at the same time prevented my bishop b5 check. Bishop d7 would have been good as well, but then knight e5 would have been a good reply, and his position quickly implodes, particularly after I played d takes e6. So instead here, after his knight d7, I now chose to capture on e6, because now he can't recapture with the bishop, which would have been a preferable way of recapturing. Now he had to recapture with the pawn, and this leaves him with a weak pawn on e6 and ensures his king is still a little bit exposed. Here I found not the most obvious move. The engines like queen e3 and say that's best, and I'm sure that would have been a good move, but I again was more focused on bringing all my pieces out, so I played the rather unobvious rook to g1. But the benefit of this move is my bishop is now heading out to either c4 or b5 with a tempo gain on the queen on a1, and then my rook can later move to say e1, and I would have all of my pieces developed. Anyway, Andrew clearly didn't want me to gain a tempo on his queen, so he voluntarily moved the queen now, and I now played the bishop out to b5. This had the benefit of not only pinning his knight, but it prevents his queen going to b6, trying to offer a trade of queens and get his queen back into the game. Anyway, at this point, Andrew chose to bring another piece out, which seems a sensible thing to do, and if he can get castled, then he will, be an exchange ahead, and he will have seen off the vast danger of my attack. But I had quite a simple reply here, which was to take the knight. He recaptures with the pawn, and I said to them here, okay, all along we're trying to mount this attack. We want to prevent black from casting. How might we do that? And several of them suggested the move queen g3, obviously preventing the king going to g8, and you can see why they suggested that. But I said, no, that's not the move played. And then eventually they came up with the idea of queen to c5. And I pointed out that this move is better than g3 because it prevents castling, covers the f8 square, but it also denies the black queen access to its two safe squares on a3 and b4, which means that white now threatens to win the black queen with rook to b1. So I said clearly that can't be allowed, so in this position black played his king to f7, and this now means that my queen is under attack from the knight. And here I could have taken the knight, but I didn't want to help his development, so I simply played the calm queen to d6, which has several benefits. Firstly, the threat of winning his queen with rook b1 is still there now, and secondly, I am actually threatening to take the knight on d7, and thirdly, the queen is very well placed to also attack the e6 pawn and is that bit closer to his king. Anyway, he played knight to b6, which avoids the loss of the piece on d7, and it sets up a cunning trap. And I said to them in this position, there is a cunning trap, and I said I saw what the trap was, but the question is, what would have happened if I'd played rook to b1? And I'm pleased to say that it didn't take the group very long to find the winning reply, queen takes b5, and after knight takes, knight c4 check, and it's black that's going to emerge still with his extra exchange, and he'll also have an extra pawn, so it will be black who will emerge with a winning position here. So this would have been a disaster. It would have reversed my advantage. So if we go back to knight b6, and I said to them, no, I didn't play rook b1, but I had another move. I said, in this position, it is possible to sort of mount a very strong mating attack. I said, what do you think white could do? And I'm pleased to say again that one of the group quite quickly found the move, to his credit, and he suggested the move I played, which is knight e5 check. And I said this strips away black's defences, and clearly if the black king were to move, then the white queen can come in on e7 and threaten a very quick mate very soon thereafter. So after this move, Andrew captured the knight, and the group didn't have any trouble in seeing rook f1 check, king g6, and they also saw bishop d3 check, king h6, and then rook to f6 check. And in this position it's going to be mating 2, whichever way the black king goes, either with white playing queen e7 check and rook f8 mate, or queen takes e5 check and rook f4 mate. So that was a 20 move victory, and the interesting thing about this victory is that it really all stemmed from back on move 9 when I played king to d2, giving up the exchange. And the moral of the story here is that one should always be very careful about trying to grab material and not carrying on with developing your forces. And I'm sure when Andrew played this, he thought back in this position after queen takes b2, that he was safely regaining material, and I was going to not be able to take quick advantage of his lack of development. But this move, king to d2, just changes everything. And after this, the position is as I said, a win for white. And although there were other variations than the moves we saw, they wouldn't have changed the actual outcome of the game. So that's all I want to say about this at this stage. So thank you for that, and we'll leave it there for now.